Good morning, everyone. Today we will be talking about the third chapter, which is Auditor's Responsibility. Now, just a brief reminder on again what is your responsibility as an auditor. So, as an auditor, you are responsible to design the audit to provide, again, reasonable assurance. Why reasonable assurance? Because there are inherent risks or inherent limitations when you are doing audit. Now, you provide reasonable assurance of detecting material misstatements in the financial statement. Since we are focusing more on financial statement audits, so of course, those misstatements in relation only to your financial statements. Or again, keyword here is material. So when is a misstatement considered as material or not? Now, misstatements can come from different things, diba? So misstatements may be because of errors, it may be due to fraud, or it may be due to non-compliance with laws and regulations. So we will be talking about each of these misstatements or each of these sources of misstatements one by one. Now take note that I will be talking more instead of visual, so you really need to listen, diba? Not everything that I say will be shown in the PowerPoint. So let us begin. Okay. So first is, of course, error. Now, when we talk about error, it refers to unintentional misstatements in the financial statement. Keyword here is unintentional. Again, when you talk about errors, it should be unintentional, meaning the individual have no, or the individual didn't really plan to commit such mistake or such error. Again, it is unintentional. So that includes omission of an amount or a disclosure, such as mathematical or clerical mistakes in the underlying data records of an accounting data, an incorrect accounting estimate arising from oversight or misinterpretation of facts, or mistakes in the application of accounting policies. So, again, when you talk about error, ang inyong yung hinumduman kay it is unintentional. So, it may be nga na-overlook ra siya sa staff because again, humans as we are very capable of doing errors, diba? Or we are very susceptible to mistakes. So, that is why common kind of mga errors. Now, good thing in accounting is we have ways to correct our errors, diba? Pwede rin na to pwede rin mag-adjusting entry. So, if naman gani mga errors or kana mga omissions, we can just easily record it. So, again, errors can be sources of misstatements in your financial statement. So, dili pasabot nga, hala, naalagi ni, wala na error ni imuhang unang-hunaon kay, na ni nagkawat or na ni something fraudulent activity nga nahitabo, diba? So, not necessarily. Sometimes, honest mistakes happen. So, kana siya error. Next source of misstatement is fraud. Now, when we talk about fraud, it is different from error since fraud is an intentional act. Ang error ganiha is unintentional, ang fraud is intentional. Meaning, imuhag yung ginatuyo nga bumistake ka. So, fraud can either be done by the management or the employees. Now, although fraud is a broad legal concept, the auditor is primarily concerned with fraudulent acts that cause a material misstatement in the financial statement. So, diba, there are different types of fraud activities in an organization. However, as an auditor, imo ang focus lang are those activities that will affect the financial statement. So, unsa man ang mga activities, katong mga activities nga naay impact sa imuhang mga accounts. So for example, in relation to your cash, in relation to your AR, to your fixed assets. So kana nga mga fraudulent activities, in relation to those, dapat aware ka na or dapat kahibaw ka unsaon pag ilaan na nga mga activities if you are an auditor. Now, fraud, topic of fraud is not new to you since na-discuss na ni sa inyong accounting tutuan, diba? I think third chapter said ni or second chapter about ethics, fraud, and internal control, diba, sa inyong AIS. Now, just a recap, there are two types of fraud. We have the management fraud and the employee fraud. So again, management fraud and the employee fraud. Now, when we talk about management fraud, of course, these are intentional na mga misstatements that are really done to deceive your financial statement na users. Meaning, kani siya is manipulation, falsification of documents or of records, or kanang mga misrepresentation, kanang gituyo gyud nga dili i-record ang specific nga mga transactions, or if naa man gani i-record is naay mga pang-usabon nga mga amounts, di ba? Those are examples of management fraud. Now, management fraud is slightly difficult, or it's more difficult to what do you call that? Mas lisod siya sakpon ang management fraud because of course the people involved are those people that have the power in your organization. So for instance, kanang mga managers, inyong mga supervisors, or even kanang nanagid sa top management, di ba? They are very capable of doing management fraud because again, they have the power. So if ikaw employee ra ka tapos ignon ka sa imong manager or supervisor nga, oh, you do this, you do that, then ikaw kabawod ka sa imong self na that is something wrong, or that is against, or that is ethically incorrect, or ingon ana nga mga instances, magduha-duha sad ka, di ba? Because staff ra gud ka, tas ang nagsugo na sa imuha is imuha lang manager, imuha lang supervisor, di ba? So nagyo mga inana nga mga instances. So if you are an auditor, you really need to put yourself in the shoes of the management and in the shoes of the employees. So kung ako ang management, unsa kaya ako mga pwede buhaton, di ba? What are the scope of my power that will allow me to do things that should not be done? So ingon ana siya. Now, you also try to think nga dapat dili ka mo salig og maayo sa management, like as mentioned before in our previous chapters, di ba nga dapat not everything that is given by the management is mo agree ra gyud si auditor. So you need to maintain your professional skepticism because again, mas dali kayo makabuhat og fraudulent activities si management since sila man anay authority and power over the organization. Now, the next kind of fraud is employee fraud. So, employee fraud, of course, these are fraudulent activities done by the employees. Now, this kind of fraud usually is a misappropriation of assets. What do you mean by misappropriation of assets? This means na mangawat og mga assets sa company. Diba? For example, kanang mga bond papers, mga ballpen, mga supplies sa office, di ba, gamito nimo for personal use. So, that is already an example of misappropriation of assets. So, kinsa man ang kasagaran mo buhat ana, diha na mo kami ng mga employees. Nga naman, justification of their actions kay ang mga decisions po sa management. Like, for example, the employee is not well compensated. So, muana si employee nga, pangwaon ko niya ang mga bond papers niya, ako ang itinda kay para nakoy laing kwarta since di bitaw ko tarong magsildo sa company. Mga inana nga mga justifications ba. So, gana mo na kasagaran. Or kanang, since our employees man ang naa sa operations yun yung department, so sila man ang kanang as to the recording mga ina nga mga instances, so mas susceptible sila to do mga activities that have connections with your customers or with your suppliers, like for instance baron collection of receivables from your customers, di ba? Si naman jud kay layason baron ana or naman kay agent ana, di ba, nga employee. So instead of remitting the full amount, o maingon si employee baron nga kani nga si customer A is wala pa ni siya ni bayad, but in reality ni bayad na gid si customer A, di ba? Nana nga mga instances. So those are examples of employee fraud or basically misappropriation of assets. Now, when we talk about fraud, of course, balik ka sa imuhang if you can remember in your AIS, di ba, naatay mga justifications or natay gitawag nga fraud triangle. So, fraud triangle nimo is, of course, kato, you have first is your rationalization. Nganong mobuhat ka ng fraudulent activities. Diba? Okay, gamay maghihatag nga sweldo si employee nako or si employer nako and so on and so forth. You also have your opportunity. So, for instance, if ikaw ang custodian for that specific asset, of course, mas dako ang imong opportunity nga mo commit o fraud or mas dako ang chance nga makakommit ka og fraud, diba? Since you have the custodianship. And lastly is the pressure. So, pressure sa imuhang work baron, or for instance, naghihirap ka or something kanang you really need cash or you really need financial assistance, tapos kana wala kay laing mapagkuhaan kay agi you are not well compensated by the company. So if high ang imuhang what do you call that, if high kaani nga mga factors like taas ang pressure sa imuha, and then you have a great opportunity, so dako kay chance nga imong irrationalize ang imuhang buhaton, so most likely you are able to commit fraud. So ingon ana siya, as an auditor lang is you need to keep in mind that there are really individuals who may be susceptible to committing fraudulent activities. So that is why when we do audit, there are really accounts that are inherently risky because they are very much susceptible to fraud. For instance, cash, accounts receivable, kana mga highly liquid na mga assets, o kana sila mga susceptible na sila to fraudulent activities. So, for instance, if nagani kay mga makitaan nga mga imbalance or mga wala matarong og record baron or naay mga lacking documentations, dili gyud nimo pwede tangtangon or dili gyud nimo i-disregard ang possibility nga naanay nahitabo diha nga fraudulent activities. Though again, mag-una gyapon ka sa katong error no, basin human mistake ra ni. But if dili gan human mistake o diha na come in nga basin na ni fraudulent activity na involved, so ingon na dapat ang imong dili kay error ra siguro ni okay wala na imo ra pasagdaan, imo ra ikaw na ang mo justify nga error ra lagi ning wala lagi nila ko kay tungod di ra kaganahan mo investigate, di ba? Ina na nga mga instances. So you need to keep in mind always na possible gyud nga ma-happen ni sa mga organizations. Again, possible siya, but not all organizations have this. There is a possibility lang, and then there are accounts that are really highly or inherently risky or very susceptible to fraud. So kanas lang ng mga accounts, lahi po imong technique sa pag-audit ana nila nga mga accounts, since again they are susceptible to fraudulent activities. And then kana lang pod mo pakichismis lang pod kano sa kanang mga employees ingon ana. So you try to assess if unsa nga mga while you work with your clients' employees, you try to makichismis if kinsa nga employee ang feel nimo na ay naka-feel nag-pressure or kana sila like naman gini mga hugod-hugod nga si kani nga employee kay tungod na ospital iyahang mama or iyahang papa mo siguro ingon ana, and then siya pagid ang custodian sa ato ang mga assets baron ingon ana. So mga inana nga mga instances ba ikaw as auditor dapat heighten imong senses sa mga ingon ana, because again those are possible reasons ngano maka-commit og fraud ang usa ka individual. So same would apply sa management. So if naay management nga, for instance, there is an organization nga ang ilahang business, or you have a client nga ilahang business is losing ang ilahang business. However, igtan-aw ni mo ni manager, si manager is kanang grabe kay siya kabongga with his or her things, di ba? Like nindot kay sakyanan, dako kay balay, pero ang business is losing or something ingon na ba, where dili siya mo match bitaw. So most likely, di should most likely, but more padasad basod sa imong huna-huna nga basing gigamit for something else ang para sa business unta, mayroon nga mga instances ba. So you need to keep that in mind as well kung mo-audit ka. So again, if an auditor, dapat na agad kay professional skepticism, mo gina siya class. And then kana siya, next is as to fraud, let's talk about management responsibility. Now management responsibility, basically, di ba kung mag-audit ta, management responsibility, kung mag-audit ta, ang ilang assumption is si auditor daw is tigpangita rag mga faults, tigpangita rag ka ng mga nagbuhat og fraudulent activities and the like. However, that's not necessarily the primary responsibility of the auditor. Ano naman? Because sa management palang daan, dapat na-establish na ni management ang control. Again, si management, or if you can remember sa imuhang AIS, or imong information system, si management is dapat nag-establish na siya internal control daan sa iyahang company. Nga naman, kanang internal control ang help sa business to mitigate the risk of fraudulent activities or of errors. Kana siya, so management should be able to establish a strong control environment, or should have a strong internal control policies and procedures na i-implement sa business to make sure that errors and frauds kay imuha siyang malikayan, di ba? So balik ka ato imong mga controls, katong controls as to transaction authorization, as to verification, as to segregation of duties, katong mga different kinds of controls helpful to siya in order for the company to maintain its integrity, diba? So kana siya mo dyan ang primary responsibility ni management. So dili pwede nga si management iyang pasanginlan si auditor no nga ikaw maggood kay sobraan ra kaayo ka for instance, sobraan ra kayo ka strict nga maskin wala jud gani issue din ha kay imong buhatan og issue tungod lang ani tungod ana isa po niya. Kung ikaw auditor mag-think ka in the first place, dili na siya ma-discover sa auditor if tarong ang internal control sa company, diba? So mao gina siya. That is why sa audit procedures gyud nato appeal gyud ang assessment sa ato ang internal control, because matter man na siya as mentioned before, as to the level of intensity of your audit procedures or imong mga testings nga pangbuhaton, matter man ang imong internal control. So magsugod gyud na sa management, or na gyud ang primary responsibility gyud is sa imong management. So meaning si management, if ganahan siya malikayan ng mga errors or mga fraudulent activities, they need to make sure that those individuals that are charged with governance really has the integrity, really has the passion for service sa company, nga wherein iput nila ang beneficial sa company first before themselves. So kana na ang ilahang hinumduman per me. So kani nga mga responsibilities mura lang siya general, but just keep in mind always nga in relation gid gyapon siya sa imong financial statements, since we are talking about financial statement audit. So ato mga individuals nga akong gipasabot, examples of which include kana mga CFO, imong accounting managers, para lang ang mga individuals man na siya akong pasabot. Now let's move on to auditor's responsibilities. Now okay, kani, these are your responsibilities niya. Puhon, di ba? Now, as mentioned before, atong prime responsibility as an auditor is to give our opinion. give our opinion on the financial statements. However, dili jud makalikayan nga kasagaran or ang ilahang stereotype nga assumption di ba sa auditor nga tigpangita og mga fraud, tigpangita og kanang mga tigsakop og mga fraudulent activities or tigkuan og mga errors and the like. So those are just byproducts of our responsibilities, di ba? Dili ang auditor ang primary responsible for the prevention and detection of your fraud and errors. Prevention responsibility na siya ni management. So, wait, where is my cursor? So, si management, so kani imuhang internal control, ang iyahang buhaton is for prevention. Mo gina siya ang main responsibility of prevention is naagyod ni management. Now, si auditor, ang kanang iyahan na lang is if walay tarong na prevention, diha na mo come-in ang mga detections ni internal or ni auditor. So, nakakang auditor ang detection. Muna sa audit, na tayo audit risk, appeal di my handwriting is very bati, I apologize. So, appeal na diha ang imuhang detection risk, di ba? Or unsay ability sa auditor nga ma-detect na niya nga mga misstatement. So, kana na siya sa auditor. But however, again, prevention is the responsibility of the management. Now, let's talk about the auditor's responsibility in each phase of your audit process. So, first is the planning phase. So, sa planning na phase, diri palang daan, dapat ma-establish na ni auditor kung unsa ang mga possibilities nga si management is makakommit og mga misstatements because of fraud and error. So, meaning, diri sa planning phase, na nakay assessment, di ba? Imuha ng it's so hard to use mouse. So, imuha ng i-assess. Haha. Bala na class. So, nanakay assessment sa imuhang client, including the internal control of the client or the controls established, the own company's assessment to their risk. So, maskin sila, kabaw ba sila kung unsa ang mga areas nga highly risky sa ilaha. So, apil na po din ha ang kanang mga areas nga feel ni management is na ay something wrong. So, nanam ginay mga inana nga mga instances nga si management mismo request nga, can you give more emphasis on this certain nga department because for the past few months or the past few weeks, kay ingon ani ilang performance and so on and so forth. So, dapat kana tanan is i-take into consideration na nimo sa planning phase palang daan. So, included na po din ha ang pag-inquire nimo sa management as to how their processes work, as to who does what, mga nga mga instances. So, basically, more on assessment yun sa planning phase para makasabot ka kung where the organization or where the client stands, bitaw. So, kana siya, i-assess lang yun mo siya, assessment of risk, i-assess nimo if susceptible ba si client sa fraud or sa error. Again, your assessments should be based on the client's internal control or their pre-existing na mga policies and procedures. So, kana siya, mo na siya ang maka-help sa imuha. So, in this phase, again, dapat na akay professional skepticism. Dili na wala. So, dapat dili ka uwaw nga mangutana if you have any concerns or if you have any clarifications about the procedures of the client. So, imo dyan ang ipangutan na kay para again, makamake ka og correct assessment. Kay, lain masad kayo nga magsigir kag-assume nga ay based sa ako ang nakitaan ingon ana. However, third party baya ka as an auditor, you really don't know everything. So, for you to take a full assessment on what is really happening in the organization, it is much better na mo ask gyud ka. So, kana inquiry gyud. Mo inquire gyud ka. So, mangutana ka sa mga staff, sa managers, sa supervisors, or all the people involved in the processes kung unsa ilang mga practices, unsa ang ilang kasagaran ginabuhat, and then you compare it with what are in their written policies and procedures, di ba? If naabay mga mismatch or naabay mga non-compliance, o so, sa mga inan nga things nga in relation to the employees having the opportunity or having the chance to increase their opportunity in committing errors and frauds, or in having the chance nga mas madako ang ilahang pressure baron. Kay for instance, let's say pressure pa man si manager at sige ingon ni employee nga dapat dako atong sales and so on and so forth niya, masking wala goy sales gyud, so si employee ako na lang ning ipadako ang sales o yan lang i usbon ang mga records kay para lang mo dako og sales kay mo may ganahan ni manager. So mga ina nga mga situations ba dapat i-appeal na niya nimo sa imuhang niyang assessment. So in the planning phase napo tay gitawag nga mga what do you call that, fraud risk factors, which are also found in your book. So kana siya mga fraud risk factors, these are mga examples, diba, na pwede nimo basihan kung unsa ang mga possible nga buhaton sa either sa management or sa employee para makakommit sila og fraud in their financial reporting. So you have take a look lang nga in your book, di ba, mga fraud risk factors relating to misstatements resulting from fraudulent financial reporting. And then there are others that are resulting from management na fraud, diba? So mo include na din ang management's characteristic, the control environment, in relation to industry's conditions, in relation to their operating characteristics and financial stability. So there are a lot of things found in your book nga nga pwede mahimong reasons or again factors wherein makakommit og fraud ang usa ka management or ang usa ka employee. So if ato ta employee kato asud the susceptibility of assets in misoperation or risk factors relating to controls. So na mga ina nga mga instances. So you just scan it yourself sa inyong book. There are a lot of risk factors there. So kato siya is mga examples na lang, so pwede rin ito nyo basahon on your own time, no? So next, let's move on to the testing phase. Okay. Now, during the course of your audit, there are instances wherein the auditor may encounter something that may indicate that there is a possibility of fraud or error. For example, kato kung gimension ganina, if na kay makitaan nga mga mismatch or mga discrepancy, ang imuhang initial thought is error ba ni siya or fraud? Mag-inana imuhang initial kuan. So, in order for you to verify that is where you perform additional procedures. So, mubuhat kag mga additional procedures in order for you to determine if such material misstatement really exists. Now, may it be due to error or may it be due to fraud. So, nakay testings nga pangbuhaton or nakay mga additional nga mga procedures nga pangbuhaton. Now, once you have identified if it is a material misstatement or not, then you should consider if it is a result of fraud or error. Kaya ang imong testing ang imong unang gibuhat is imo pang gi-identify na kay nakitaan nga mga discrepancies baron or mga questionable na areas nga naay mismatch, wala proper documentation and so on and so forth. So imong i-identify if kana siya nga butang is naka-cause ba na siyang material misstatement. Now, based on your procedure done, na-identify nimo nga yes, naka-cause siya material misstatement. So ato lang let's write down there. So again, imuhang unang pag-decide is if it caused a material misstatement. Now, if ma-identify na nimo if material misstatement ba siya, ang sunod mong dapat i-answer if it is due to error or if it is due to fraud. So mo na imong sunod nga dapat hinumduman or you need to ask, di ba? Is it due to error or fraud? Kay mumatter man siya. If due to error, okay ra, kay nga naman. makamake kag adjustments, yun na, like, wala ra siya gituyo. So, imo lang is you can reprimand the employees, kaya you need to be careful when you do this and you do that, when you do recordings and so on and so forth. Kay, honest mistake naman siya. However, if the misstatement is a result of fraud, diri na nimo come in nga medyo mas kuan na siya, mas lahi na imuhang angay buhaton, di ba? Now, if what you've assessed is that if the misstatement is, let's say, not material, if you've discovered that the misstatement is not material, however, fraudulent kaya po siya, meaning not material, example, ginagmay ra iyang gibuhatan, nangawat siya ballpen, nangawat siya bond papers, or sa panang mga supplies din ha, or nangawat siya cash, pero at a minimum amount, may na nga mga instances ba, those are not material na amounts na. Auditor, dili ka ang mga saba sa employees ha, so of course, you need to contact the appropriate nga management, kasi dapat musturya ana niya, and then, you need to tell the client kung unsay mga implications ani iyang gibukat, diba? Nga nanguha si ani, so, for instance, supplies, ang imong on hand nga supply yun, like physical count of your supply does not match with what is in your financial statements, ingon ana, so tendency is mas ma-increase ang imong expenses kay makapalit ka og laing mga supplies, since in reality ang on hand yun is gamay na lang kagikwaan. So mga inanang instances, you tell the management the implications of the fraudulent na activity. Now, if it is a material fraud, diri dapat ipasabot ni auditor still the same no with the non-material fraud nga unsay mga implications kinsa ang mga people involved. Pero aside from that, you need to determine as well as an auditor na dapat na kay proper evidence gyud nga mao na ang gibuhat sa client, or you need to obtain evidence to determine whether material fraud really exists. Kay if sayop sad ka sa auditor, makasuhan sa anak lang. So, makasuhat kay istapa kay nanangil ka, di ba, nga nangawat siya niya, wala siya nangawat. So, ina lang ang mga instances, mas heavier naman ihang mga legal implications if material if material fraud na ang imuhang na-discover, di ba? Unlike if non-material, madala pa siguro admin hearing, may na nga mga instances. But if material fraud na gani, nga, unsa man, mukamin na ang legal department sa entity, unsa man, pasakahan na ba ning kaso ang kaninga employee, kay tungod sa ihang gibuhat, or kaninga certain management, or kaninga certain individual, tungod sa ihang fraudulent activity na gibuhat. So, na may mga inana nga mga instances, so mas heavier man ang weight if material na fraud na gani ang imong nakitaan. So, dapat, as an auditor, ikaw gud ang ni-claim ana nga nakay, ikaw gud ang ni-claim nga material na siya nga fraud ang iyang gibuhat. So, dapat na kay proper evidences na ika-suporta sa imuhang claim, because those evidences will be presented as well in court. Diba? Muna yung mutabang sa management nga, kana siya as when magkaso-kaso na gani nga time, so kana sa imuhang mga makitaan nga mga evidences, o mo na ipakita niya sa korte nga, o kanidyo siya nga individual is involved in this specific kind of activity, and so on and so forth. So, mo na siya sa testing phase. Tanan. Now, next is the completion phase. Now, sa completion phase, in this phase is that the auditor should obtain a written representation from the client's management that it acknowledges its responsibility for the implementation and operation of accounting and internal control systems that are designed to prevent and detect fraud and error. It should disclose to the auditor all significant facts relating to any fraud or suspected frauds known to the management that they may have affected the entity. So basically, in your completion phase is dapat na lang your proper disclosure and communications whenever fraudulent activities are found or suspected to be in the client or in the organization. So kana siya dapat in writing gid siya tanan no nagi na siya sa imong or sa imong it is well communicated to your client. So unsa ang mga responsibilities, kinsa ang buhat ani, kinsa ang buhat ana. So nagi na yung mga written representations. Same would apply if kung error class kana mga adjustments nga imong pangbuhaton sa imuhang financial statement tungod kay due to error, those should still be documented. Upon audit, the following accounts are to be adjusted because of this and that, and so on and so forth. So, apil na dapat sa imuhang completion nga phase. And then lastly is your audit report. So, kani sa audit report, ang imuha lang ani is again, di ba, you already give you in your auditor's report, you will be giving your opinion as to the fair representation of the financial statements of the entity. Now, if the auditor believes that the material error or fraud exists, therefore, the auditor should request the management to revise their financial statements. Okay, again, di ba, the financial statement is the responsibility of the management. So, ikaw auditor, if nakinakitaan yung mga material misstatements, of course, management is mandatory or is complied to change the initial financial statement given, di ba? So, dapat mo fairly present ang gid siya based on the auditor's findings. Now, if the management would not do the adjustments that are to be done, diha na mo come in nga si auditor can already give a qualified or an adverse opinion. Meaning, it states that the company is not, or the client is not fairly presenting their financial statements, or if adverse mga ni state nimo dito kung unsa ang mga si client is not willing to make adjustments to their financial statements. So, you need to include that in your report. Now, apil po diha, you can also disclaim your opinion on the FS. So, meaning na kay moingon ka dito nga there are mga limitations on the scope of your audit examination. That is why you cannot give an unqualified opinion and so on and so forth. So, your auditor's report should reflect kung unsa gid ang imuhang nakit-an sa imuhang pag-audit. So, dili kay migo bitaw ni nako ang client, hatagan lang nako siya unqualified opinion. However, pag audit nimo is daghan kay kag nakit-an nga mga misstatements, di ba? Unqualified gyapon nimo gihatag nga opinion. So, dili na siya pwede class. You should always, as an auditor, you need to stand with what your responsibilities are, and then that includes you giving the appropriate opinion based on your findings or based on the results of your audit procedures. So, again, if dili deserving si client or di deserving si management sa usa ka unqualified opinion, o edi you give that client modified opinions, either qualified, adverse, or disclaimer, depending on what is applicable. So, mo lang ginaimuhang hinumduman for me. Next is, that is all about the fraud. Let's move on to non-compliance. Now, when we talk about non-compliance, it refers to acts of omission or commission by the entity being audited, either intentional or unintentional, which are contrary to prevailing laws and regulations. So, basically, non-compliance class is mura siya sagol sa imuhang fraud ug error. Mura siya inana. Ihalang gid is non-compliance with specific laws and regulations na lang. So, katong ganiha is sa imuha matong financial statements, no? So, kana na siya mga misstatements sa imong financial statements. Dinhi is iyahang gibuhat or the act is already against the laws and regulations by the government or by third parties, that should be upheld dapat by the client or by the organization. So, kato ganiha, ang imuhang wala gisunod ato kay kana mga standards, mga PFRS, mga inana mo na ang imuhang wala gisunod ato, di ba? O kung di ka mo properly disclose or kana na kay mga misstatements, those are non-compliance to your standards, to the PFRS, the PAS, or unsa pa na din ha. However, there is a non-compliance, your obligation is already to the public or to the third party or to any governing bodies sa imuhang organization. So that is why examples include tax evasion. Kaya nga naman, you have responsibilities to the BIR, siya, violation of environmental protection laws. So for instance, you are a mining company, mga nanang mines, you are a mining company, and then dapat required ka to do this and to do that. However, you are not doing this and you're not doing that. So you have violations to environmental protection law. And then inside trading of securities. So kani siya is against nasa kanang PSE, di ba? So kanang parang dako ang imuhang market value sa imong shares baron, o so mag-inside trading ka or na kay na dunggan nga hugon-hugon nga mo gamay ang value ani niya, so kana mga shares sa imuhang company karon is imo na sa ipang disclose kay na kay na ni leak nga or na kay na dunggan nga mo gamay and so on and so forth. So those are examples of inside trading. So they can cause imbalance as to your market, di ba? So mo na siya ang mga examples of non-compliance. Now, just like your fraud, napod na responsibilities si management and responsibilities si auditor. Now, let's talk about the management responsibility first. Now, si management responsibility. Okay, management responsibility. Now, as part of the management, it is your responsibility to ensure that the entity's operations are conducted in accordance with laws and regulations. So, meaning, if wala na gani ka, for instance, kabaw gani ka nga ang imuhang company is VAT entity na siya. However, wala gyapon ka, imuhang gi-follow gyapon is non-VAT, o kana siya, ang fault na niya is ni management na, di ba? Kasi management man ang nipili nga wala mo follow og VAT, imbis dapat kay VAT na siya, so lahi na iyang rates and everything else. So, management again, siya ang naay responsibility to ensure the implementation and the compliance with laws and regulations. So, the responsibility for the prevention and detection of non-compliance rests with the management. Now, the following policies and procedures may assist management in discharging its responsibilities for the prevention and detection of non-compliance. Examples include monitoring legal requirements and ensuring that operating procedures are designed to meet these requirements. For example, kanang annual nga mga business permit, di ba? It is the responsibility of the management to make sure nga nakakuan yung business permit annually, appeal man na din ha ang kanang pag-conduct nimo, for instance, pag-conduct nimo annual physical examination sa imong employees, appeal man na siya before ka makakuha og business permit. So, si management sayop na siya if mingon siya nga ay dili na lang ta magpa-APE sa atong mga employees, mugna-ara na diha tanan para process sa itong business permit, which should not be done, di ba? Kaya it is already non-compliance to the laws and regulations. Apil man na sa requirements sa business permit ang pag-conduct ni mong APE sa imong mga employees. So, dapat si management is mo allot yung budget for the physical examinations of their employees. So, it is part of their it is part of their responsibilities. So, another is, again, dili mawala ang imuhang internal control. Dapat napod kay internal control as to your compliance with laws and regulations. So, dapat nakastate yun sa imong mga policies and procedures when your staff should process this specific BIR form, when your staff should process this specific or dapat inyuha na mo work na mo on a specific nga mga requirements before the stated deadline sa kung unsa mga na sa BIR, sa SEC, or sa any government agency nga gihatag, di ba? Dapat naka-integrate na siya sa imong system or sa imuhang policies daan naka-state na gina dito nga dapat kaninga account or kaninga specific kind of transaction should be done before the end of the 8th day of the month because the deadline of the BRR form is on the 10th day. Mga nga mga instances ba, dapat naka-indicate na ni management because that is one way of them increasing their or strengthening their control against or strengthening their control on the compliance with laws and regulations. So, another thing, it's also the responsibility of the management to train their employees, di ba? To do mga seminars and mga orientations, diba? Apil na tanan sa management apil na tanan sa responsibility sa management to follow the proper code of conduct, diba? So, nanay mga inanang mga instances. Now, if the management is not so familiar with those things, kana mga laws and regulations, or the management can have a legal department para mo guide sa ilaha in terms of mga legal nga mga requirements, di ba? So, mga inana nga mga responsibilities. Mo-help po ang legal in the sense nga if there are mga legal obligations baron, for instance, di nato malikayan na baro employee nga ni pasaka og kaso sa dole or mga inana nga mga instances, or even ang company nakadawat bag notice from the BIR nga ingon ana si company is dili siya knowledgeable pila ka number of days di ay ka dapat ma-respond sa certain kind of mga notifications nga gihatag, di ba lahi ba na there are others nga dapat within 15 days nga na-receive ang notice is makasend na ka og response, there are others 10 days, 30 days, and so on and so forth. So ang mga kaibawan na is kanang nasa imong legal department, so para dili na nimo ma-overlook ang mga ingon ana nga mga butang o apil po sa responsibility sa management nga mo hire sila og mga legal advisors nila para again as mo assist or kanang mo guide sa ilaha in terms of mga legal nga mga matters. So basically tanan nga itabo sa ka-entity responsibility jud na siya ni or samtang naa pa siya sa suits organization, it is the responsibility of the management. So, kana siya. Now, kung ikaw auditor as to your non-compliance, so si management, same lang gyapon sa fraud ha. Preventive gyapon siya. Si auditor, detection si auditor. So, nagyapon ta atoy mga different phases. So, planning phase, if sa fraud, imuhang gi-assist ang risk involved diri sa planning phase as an auditor, you need to be aware of the legal and regulatory frameworks that are applicable to the client or to the industry of the client. So, dapat aware ka kung unsa nga mga applicable BIR regulations ang sa imong client. Like, for example, your client is a large taxpayer. So, dapat kabaw ka unsa nga mga provisions ang naa sa mga BIR memorandums or sa mga BIR nga mga circulars ang applicable sa mga large taxpayers. Kaya lahi man siya in comparison to SMEs, diba? Lahi man siya treatment, lahi mag-deadlines ang mga large taxpayers, na siya mas daghan man siya scope, ina na nga mga instances. So, as an auditor, dapat kabaw ka ani nga mga legal and regulatory framework. So, dapat kabaw ka if si client asa ba siya dapat na-register sa DTI ba, sa SEC ba, ito nga nga mga instances. So dapat knowledgeable ka ana as an auditor. With that, you should also be knowledgeable with the client's industries because again, there are certain industries that have specific nga mga requirements. For instance, ganiya kato kong gi-mention, if you are a mining company, you need, aside from kanang mga normal nga mga business or kanang mga BIR, SEC, kanang mga governing bodies or kanang mga government agencies, naapod kay mga responsibilities in following the regulations set by the ENR. May na nga mga instances ba? Or if you are an airline industry, dapat mo follow ka sa kanang mga policies and procedures or mga laws and regulations set by CAAP or kana sa aviation nga industry sa Philippines. So mga inana, dapat aware ka ana as an auditor unsa na nga mga special nga mga governing bodies or mga agencies ang naay or ang appeal ang imuhang client sa ilang scope of work, di ba? So dapat imuha nang research or dapat na kay knowledge ana no. If wala ka kabaw ana or if dili jud ka sure specifically, like if your client is new or if the industry of your client is something new to you, or you can ask that sa imuhang client. Also, client, kabaw ba kaon sa nga mga agencies ang naa kay mga responsibilities or sa nga mga specific nga mga legal and regulatory frameworks ang dapat imuhang gina-follow. So you would discuss that with your client. So you can ask kung unsa na ang inyong gisunod, unsa nga mga policies ang ni-inline sa unsa ang mga national policies, may na nga mga instances. So you talk about it, you inquire with your client, you talk about it kung unsa na ilang na-comply, unsa ilang wala ma-comply. Like for example, kato if from non-VAT sila to VAT, so unsa ilang dapat mahibaw-an, may na nga mga instances ba. So dapat imo na siyang storyaan with your client. And then another thing is you also need to discuss with your client, or you also, as an auditor, you should also have an understanding of the procedures and policies that can help you identify instances of non-compliance. So, mangutana ka ni client, if wala sila ni comply, ani, what are you doing? Diba? Unsa imuhang mga kana action plan if naa kay non-compliance sa kaninga specific law or kaninga specific nga regulation, unsa ang gibuhat ni management ana. So na ba siya specific policy nga naka-state nga dapat mo comply gid ani, or na ba siya specific policy indicating kanus about correspondence, kato kung i-mention nga niya, mo respond ka sa mga notifications sent by governing bodies, may na nga mga instances. So, dapat you as an auditor should be aware of those policies and procedures. Para again, it all boils down again to control. Dapat aware ka sa mga control procedures sa entity. Same would apply to you obtaining proper evidences. So, dapat kabaw na kaon sa nga mga areas ang kani dapat gyud nako hatagan og emphasis, or dapat ma-properly document gyud nako or makuha ng evidence kas kani ang ilang isa sa ilang mga weak areas in terms of control with non-compliance inana. So apil na siya sa imong planning phase daan or gi-take into consideration na siya nimo. And the next is your testing phase. So similar ra siya sa imong fraud, pero ilisa lang nimo ang fraud ug non-compliance. However, the things you do are just the same. So, meaning, imong i-evaluate gihapon if kana nga non-compliance is naa ba siya impact baron sa imong financial statements. So, kato, di ba mo rin kag nag-assess if it is a material misstatement or not, and if it is due to fraud or error. Pero dili lang is if the non-compliance has a possible effect on the financial statements, and if not, is it material or not. So kato, for instance, VAT na di ay ka pero wala ka ni follow sa VAT na policies, so meaning wala ka nag withhold og tarong, di ba? Wala ka ni claim og input, wala ka nag output, and so on and so forth. So kana siya is naman na siya impact sa imong mga sa imong financial statements. So imo na siyang pang tan-awon as an auditor unsa ang mga possible financial consequences of such non-compliance. Now, another thing, if na gani non-compliance, ang possible impact gid ana or ang common impact gid ana is the occurrence of mga penalties and surcharges. Di mo ginamawala nga. If late ka mo file ani sa imong kaning BR4, maka-incur ka og penalty, interest, surcharge, and so on and so forth. So, imuha nang i-anticipate na siya ni mudaan, or imuha na siyang i-take into consideration nga o kani siya nga possible consequence kan magkinahanglan ni og, or kani siya nga specific nga non-compliance is magkinahanglan ni og specific nga mga disclosures, mga inana nga mga instances. So dapat na siyang imuhang take into consideration tanan. And then also di gyud mawala no ang imuhang documentation. So kato about obtaining proper evidences, and then your discussion with management, if na mga ni kay mga nakitaan nga mga non-compliance. So of course you talk with the management nga kani siya, this is a possible non-compliance, so you can expect that you will receive a letter niya from BIR containing this possible specific percentage of penalty or surcharge ingon ana. So imo na siyang i-communicate ni client tanan. Now possible pa lang siya kay of course imo pa mang i-evaluate no, there are still chance to improve or there are still a room for improvement or room for changes, diba? So imo nang ipasabot na ni client ka if dili na nila buhaton o if dili gid mo comply ani nga specific law and regulation, pag expect na lang gid mo nga makadawat mo ani nga specific penalty or kani nga specific nga surcharge, imo na nang iingunta na ni client, imo na siyang i-disclose na apud kay mga documentations ana as to basis sa paghatag nimo, like for example pakit-an mo si client og copy sa BIR memorandum or sa BIR nga regulation, may na nga instances. And then completion phase is just the same. Again with the fraud, dapat na agyoy written representations tanan. Written representations that the management has disclosed to the auditor all known actual or possible non-compliance with laws and regulations that could materially affect the financial statements. Again, nganong important man ni, pwede man si client mo ingon nga niingon naman ko nimo ana nga ingon ana tapos ikaw di auditor is wala jud kag giingan ni client, so wala ka nakahatag og advice kung say dapat buhaton ni client, diba? Then ang ending is buta nato si client is naka-penalty. So ibalik na noon ni client sa imo nga wala man gud ko nimo ingni nga ingon ana mo na penalty na lang noon ko. Tapos ikaw auditor nga wala man ko kabaw nga na kay ingon ana kay wala ka mo ingon nako. So to avoid those situations, dapat na gi written representation or gi-document yun na din nga giingonan ni management tanan nga mga possible non-compliance nila and so on and so forth. So the auditor is made aware of those instances. So dapat naka explicitly state yun na siya kay para walay blaming na mahitabo, no? And then of course still the same sa auditor's report, you need to give an appropriate report. Kung dili gapon mo sunod si client or nagyapon siya mga non-compliance, you can always issue a modified opinion. So you can either issue a qualified, adverse, or a disclaimer of an opinion. So kana jud, your audit report should fairly present what is really happening in the client. So that is the non-compliance. So basically, as a recap, let's have a recap. As a recap, ato alang ron is your response. Oops. So your responsibilities again as an auditor is to give an opinion, and then you design an audit that will provide a reasonable assurance of detecting material misstatements either from fraud, error, and non-compliance. So as an auditor, you have the responsibility to make sure that whatever your findings are, the opinions you are giving are really fairly presenting what is happening in the company. Now, it is not your responsibility as an auditor to prevent these following na mga errors, frauds, and non-compliance. No? Again, prevention is not your responsibility. It's all the management's responsibility. Ang imuha lang is you can detect these material misstatements due to fraud and you can do the appropriate course of action that needs to be done if ever you encounter these things. So, you need to talk with the proper individuals that are involved, with the proper management. You need to apply the proper procedures in order for you to make sure that you really are detecting material misstatements, or you need to apply the appropriate audit procedures in order for you to gather more evidences if there are suspicions of misstatements. So, mo ginang imuhang primary responsibility as an auditor. So later on is later on in our succeeding chapters, may encounter niya na ninyo nga mga specific niya nga mga detection risk, di ba nga imuhang pag-assess kung pilay mo mahatag nga assurance o sa ka-entity based on your risk assessment. So, may mga inana nga mga instances. So, kanilang are just general responsibilities of the auditor. If makabantay mo, balik-balik lang gid siya, no? Kasagaran. However, basically, wala na sa balik-balik ang trabaho sa audit class. Whatever client you are engaged in, naaman jud kay mga basic na mga procedures na ginasunod or kanang mga fundamental procedures, di ba? Mapunan lang na siya if nanay mga specialized nga mga industries or there is something special about your client, nalang na siya mga add-ons. However, the foundation good or kanang the backbone of the audit would always be the same. So, dapat mo na yun kay gina-follow nga proper programs. Nala kay mga additionals ana para mo cater sa kung say applicable sa imong client. However, as to the general concept, it's just the same. So, I hope you learned something in today's report. And then if you have any questions about the discussion, please do not hesitate to email me or send a private message sa Google Chat. That would be all and have a good day.